Mom, did you like the lake house I gave you? My son's question sliced through the Thanksgiving dinner like cold wine through broken glass. For a moment, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. The dining room suddenly felt too warm, too bright, too quiet all at once. I stared across the polished oak table at Daniel, my 38-year-old son, still holding the serving spoon in one hand while steam curled from the sweet potatoes in front of me. "What lake house?" I asked softly. The smile faded from his face almost instantly. Beside him, Vanessa stopped moving completely. Her wine glass froze halfway to her lips. Even the tiny gold bracelet around her wrist seemed to stop glittering beneath the chandelier light. "The house on Lake Morrison," Daniel said slowly. "The one I bought for you 2 years ago." My chest tightened so suddenly I had to grip the edge of the table beneath the tablecloth. "Daniel," I whispered, trying to force a laugh that never came. "Honey, I think you're confused." But Daniel wasn't smiling anymore. His expression had shifted into something unsettled. Confused. Concerned. Behind him, the massive windows overlooking the backyard reflected the warm Thanksgiving lights from inside the house. Vanessa had spent hours decorating for dinner. Candles lined the center of the table beside tiny pumpkins and gold leaves arranged carefully across cream-colored linen. The entire room looked like something from a holiday magazine. But underneath all that perfection, something ugly had just cracked open. "Mom," Daniel said carefully, "I had the paperwork transferred into your name for your 66th birthday." Vanessa helped coordinate everything with my assistant. My fingers trembled slightly against my water glass. I quickly folded my hands together in my lap so no one would notice. "I never received any lake house," I said quietly. "I don't know what you're talking about." Vanessa finally set her wine glass down. Too fast. The crystal made a sharp sound against the plate beneath it. "Maybe there was some kind of mix-up," she said quickly, forcing a tight smile. "You know how paperwork gets lost sometimes." Lost. The word echoed strangely in my mind. Lost. Like the overdue electric bills folded neatly inside my kitchen drawer back home. Like the second winter coat I'd sold at a thrift store last January so I could afford my blood pressure medication. Like the nights I sat wrapped in 2 blankets because I was trying to save money on heating. Daniel stared at me now with growing disbelief. "That's impossible," he murmured. "I also set up monthly payments for you. $1,500 every month for maintenance and expenses." My heartbeat became so loud I could barely hear the room anymore. $1,500. Every month. For 2 years. I felt suddenly lightheaded. Across the table, Vanessa reached for her napkin, but her hand missed slightly before grabbing it again. Tiny things reveal people when they panic. Tiny things most families never notice. But when you've spent nearly 70 years taking care of everyone else, you learn how to notice every small shift in a room. "Daniel," I said carefully, keeping my voice calm, "I haven't received any monthly payments." Silence settled over the table so heavily it almost felt alive. From the kitchen, I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the oversized clock above the stove. Somewhere upstairs, their golden retriever barked once before going quiet again. Daniel blinked at me several times. "No," he said under his breath, almost to himself. "No, that can't be right." He reached for his phone immediately, his movements sharper now. Faster. I watched him scroll through emails while the color slowly drained from his face. Vanessa stood abruptly from her chair. "Excuse me," she said. "I just remembered I need to check on dessert." But there was no dessert in the oven. I knew because I'd helped her plate the pumpkin pie 20 minutes earlier. Daniel didn't even look at her as she disappeared into the kitchen. His attention stayed fixed on the screen in his hand. "I have confirmation receipts," he muttered. "Bank transfers. Property taxes. Insurance payments." My stomach twisted painfully. Insurance payments. Property taxes. All this time, while I'd been clipping grocery coupons at my tiny apartment kitchen table, believing my son was simply too busy to visit more often, another version of my life had apparently existed somewhere else entirely. A life with a lake house. A life with security. A life where I didn't count quarters before buying gas. I glanced toward the kitchen doorway. Vanessa's shadow moved quickly across the marble floor. She was pacing now. I could hear it in the uneven rhythm of her heels. Daniel slowly lowered his phone and looked up at me. "Mom," he said quietly, "last month alone I transferred $1,800 for repairs on the property." I felt something cold spread through my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter. Something heavier. Daniel, I said carefully. Last month I almost had my electricity shut off. His entire face changed then. I had seen that expression only once before. The day his father died. Pure disbelief colliding with reality all at once. He leaned back slightly in his chair, staring at me like he no longer recognized the conversation we were having. What do you mean? He asked. I mean, I said softly, that I've been living off my social security checks and whatever extra shifts the pharmacy gives me. Vanessa suddenly reappeared carrying the pie server, though her hands were trembling badly enough that the metal rattled softly against the plate. Who wants dessert? She asked brightly, too brightly. No one answered. Daniel turned toward her slowly. Vanessa, he said, his voice dangerously calm. Did you ever personally see the paperwork delivered to my mother? For a fraction of a second, she froze completely. Then came the smile. That polished, practiced smile I'd watched her use for years at charity events, business dinners, neighborhood parties. Of course, she said lightly. Well, I mean, I assumed your assistant handled everything. Assumed. Another strange word. Another careful little escape hatch. Daniel stood up now. No, he said firmly. You specifically told me you helped organize it because Mom was overwhelmed after Dad passed away. Vanessa swallowed hard. Daniel, maybe this isn't the right time for this conversation. But it was already too late for that. Because suddenly every lonely Christmas, every canceled visit, every missing birthday card, every strange excuse over the past 2 years had started rearranging themselves inside my mind, like puzzle pieces finally locking into place. I remembered the times Vanessa insisted she would handle communication because Daniel was too busy. The times my phone calls mysteriously went unanswered. The way she always changed the subject whenever money came up. Across the table, Daniel looked physically ill now. I realized then that whatever was happening here, he truly hadn't known. And somehow, that hurt even more. Because my son hadn't abandoned me. Someone had carefully built a wall between us brick by brick while neither of us realized it was happening. Vanessa stepped closer to him now, reaching for his arm. Honey, she said softly, you're overreacting. He pulled his arm away without even looking at her. The room fell silent again. Heavy, sharp, dangerous. Then Daniel looked back at me, and for the first time all evening, I saw fear in his eyes. Mom, he whispered, if you never got the house, then where did everything go? I barely remember leaving Daniel and Vanessa's house that night. The drive home passed in fragments of red traffic lights, blurred headlights, and the soft hum of my old heater rattling against the November cold. My hands stayed tight around the steering wheel the entire time. Not because I was angry, because suddenly I could not tell which parts of my life had been real anymore. The radio played Christmas music softly through cracked speakers, but it sounded distant, almost underwater. Outside, the town glowed with holiday lights strung across porches and storefront windows. Families were probably still gathered around dining room tables, laughing over pie and coffee while football games played in the background. Meanwhile, I drove back to a one-bedroom apartment where the refrigerator held little more than leftover soup and expired yogurt. I parked beneath the flickering parking lot light outside my building and sat there for a long time without moving. The dashboard clock read 10:42 p.m. My fingers ached from arthritis and the cold had settled deep into my knees again. I finally reached into my purse and took out my prescription bottle. 2 pills left. Payday was still 6 days away. I turned the bottle upside down and watched the tiny tablets slide against the plastic. 6 days. I swallowed hard and slipped it back into my purse. Then I looked up at my apartment building. The place looked tired even in the dark. Faded paint. Rusted railings. One of the upstairs windows still covered with cardboard from last winter's storm damage. I used to tell Daniel I liked living there because it was simple. That was the word I always used. Simple. I never wanted my son worrying about me, especially after his father died. Grief changes people in quiet ways. Daniel buried himself in work after the funeral. I buried myself in survival. Some mornings I woke up before sunrise just to pick up extra shift stocking shelves at the pharmacy. At 68 years old, my back hurt constantly, but standing all day meant I could keep my lights on without asking anyone for help. Pride can be expensive when you get older, but loneliness costs even more. I slowly climbed the stairs to my apartment and unlocked the door. The familiar smell of lavender cleaner and old books greeted me immediately. Small things comfort you when you live alone long enough. I switched on the kitchen light and stared automatically at the stack of unopened mail waiting on the counter. Electric bill, insurance notice, grocery coupons. I removed my coat carefully and hung it beside the door. The apartment was freezing again. I walked to the thermostat and lowered it another 2 degrees anyway. The heating bill last month had already been too high. Then I stopped moving completely, because suddenly all I could hear was Daniel's voice repeating inside my head. $1,500 every month. 2 years. I slowly sat down at my tiny kitchen table and looked around the apartment differently for the first time. The secondhand curtains, the cracked linoleum near the sink, the lamp beside the couch that only worked if I twisted the bulb twice. All this time, I thought my life had become smaller because that was simply what aging looked like. I thought struggling quietly was normal, respectable, even. But now another possibility sat in front of me like something poisonous. Maybe I was never supposed to struggle at all. I opened the kitchen drawer beside me and pulled out the folder where I kept all my bills. The edges were worn soft from handling. I organized everything carefully every month, because if you are poor long enough, paperwork becomes its own kind of survival skill. I spread the bills across the table beneath the weak overhead light. Late notices, minimum payments, medical statements, last February's emergency room balance when my blood pressure spiked during a snowstorm. I remembered lying to the doctor afterward, insisting I had simply forgotten my medication for a few days. The truth was uglier. I had been cutting pills in half to make them last longer. My chest tightened painfully at the memory. $1,500 every month. I pressed both hands against my temples. Something inside me wanted desperately to believe there had been a misunderstanding, a banking error, a paperwork issue, something innocent. But another part of me had already started collecting tiny memories I had ignored for years. The strange pauses whenever Vanessa answered the phone. The way she always insisted on helping Daniel manage family communication because he was so busy. The birthday cards that stopped arriving after Richard died. The missed invitations. The canceled visits. I remembered one Christmas 3 years ago when Daniel promised he would fly me out to Colorado for the holidays. I spent weeks knitting scarves for him and Vanessa. Then 2 days before my flight, Vanessa called saying Daniel had caught a terrible flu and they did not want me exposed. I stayed home alone that year, eating frozen turkey dinner beside the television. Later I saw photos online of them hosting a holiday party with neighbors. Daniel looked perfectly healthy. At the time, I convinced myself there must have been another explanation. There always was. I reached for my old laptop sitting at the corner of the table and powered it on slowly. The machine hummed loudly as it loaded. I opened my email account and typed Lake Morrison into the search bar. Nothing. Then I searched Daniel's name. Hundreds of emails appeared. Most were short, quick check-ins, holiday greetings, photos from business trips. But almost every message from the past 2 years had one thing in common. Vanessa had either sent it herself or replied on his behalf. I stared at the screen while a strange heaviness settled in my stomach. Had I spoken to my own son directly less and less because he was busy, or because someone had slowly made sure of it? My phone suddenly buzzed against the table, making me jump. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I hesitated before answering. Mom. His voice sounded different now. Tired. Uneasy. Did you get home okay? Yes, I said quietly. Silence stretched between us for a few seconds. Then he exhaled heavily. I have been going through records for the last hour, he said. The house definitely exists. The payments definitely went somewhere. I closed my eyes. Daniel. Mom, why did you never tell me things were this bad financially? The question hurt more than I expected. Because the answer was simple. Mothers from my generation were trained to protect their children from worry even after those children became adults themselves. You had your own life, I said softly. Your business. Your marriage. That is not an answer. His voice cracked slightly. I looked down at the unpaid electric bill beneath my hand. After your father passed away, I did not want to become a burden. Daniel went silent again. Then he said something so quietly I almost missed it. You were never supposed to live like this. Tears finally burned behind my eyes then, but I blinked them away quickly. Crying never solved anything. Not when Richard got sick. Not when the mortgage nearly swallowed us in the early years. Not when I stood beside a gravesite 3 winters ago, trying to imagine the rest of my life alone. Some women survive by learning how not to fall apart in front of other people. Vanessa says there must have been some kind of mistake, Daniel continued carefully. I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, because mistakes do not usually last 24 months. Mistakes do not reroute money, hide paperwork, and somehow isolate a mother from her own son little by little over years. But I still was not ready to say those thoughts out loud. Not yet. Maybe, I said quietly. But deep down, I no longer believed that word at all. After we hung up, I sat alone at the kitchen table long after midnight, staring at old bills beneath the yellow light while the apartment creaked softly around me. Somewhere outside, snow had started falling lightly against the windows. And for the first time in years, I realized something terrifying. Maybe my loneliness had never been accidental. The next morning, I woke before sunrise the way I always did. Years of early shifts at the pharmacy had trained my body not to sleep past 5:30, even on holidays. For a few seconds, lying beneath my faded blue comforter, I almost forgot what had happened the night before. Then I saw the unpaid electric bill still sitting on the kitchen counter through the bedroom doorway, and the weight returned immediately. Outside, snow covered the parking lot in a thin white layer that reflected the pale morning light. The apartment was cold enough that I could see my breath slightly when I stepped into the kitchen. I filled the coffee maker with water slowly, listening to the familiar clicks and hums while my mind replayed every word from Thanksgiving dinner. $1,500 every month. A lake house. Property taxes. Insurance payments. It still sounded unreal. Like a conversation that had happened to somebody else. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and stood by the window watching a maintenance worker shovel snow near the curb below. His boots dragged heavily across the pavement. The sound echoed faintly upward through the quiet morning air. Usually I liked mornings like this. Quiet mornings felt safe, predictable. But now the silence only made room for questions I could no longer ignore. My phone buzzed on the counter around 7:15. Vanessa. I stared at her name for several seconds before answering. Good morning, Evelyn, she said warmly, almost too warmly. Her voice carried that polished sweetness she used whenever other people were listening nearby. I just wanted to check on you after last night. I took a slow sip of coffee before responding. That was thoughtful of you. Daniel is very upset, she continued carefully. He barely slept. Neither had I. But I did not say that. I think there has simply been some confusion with paperwork, she added quickly. You know how complicated financial transfers can become. There it was again. Confusion. Mistake. Paperwork. Soft words carefully chosen to smooth over sharp truths. Maybe, I said quietly. She paused briefly, perhaps expecting more from me. Anger. Accusations. Tears. But women my age were raised differently. We learned how to survive discomfort silently long before younger generations started calling emotions healthy. Well, Vanessa continued, forcing a small laugh. I am sure everything will make sense soon. I looked around my tiny kitchen while she spoke. The outdated appliances. The crack in the ceiling above the sink. The grocery list sitting beside my purse with words crossed out because I could not afford everything at once. Milk. Bread. Eggs. Blood pressure refill. I wondered suddenly what Vanessa would think if she stood in this apartment right now. Would she feel guilty? Embarrassed? Victorious? Perhaps, I replied softly. Another silence stretched between us. Then her tone shifted slightly, sharper beneath the sweetness. Daniel can be very emotional when it comes to you, she said. I just do not want unnecessary misunderstandings damaging the family. Family. Strange how people use that word most often when they're trying to control a situation. I would never want that either, I answered calmly. After we hung up, I sat motionless at the kitchen table for several minutes, staring at the dark phone screen. Then I did something I had not done in years. I called in sick to work. My manager sounded concerned immediately. Evelyn, are you feeling all right? Just exhausted, I admitted. Which was true, but not in the way she probably assumed. Emotional exhaustion settles into the bones differently when you get older. By 10 o'clock, snow had started falling harder outside. I pulled my old cardigan tighter around myself and opened the filing cabinet beside the television. Richard used to joke that I organized paperwork like an accountant preparing for an audit. Maybe he was right. Inside the cabinet sat decades of carefully labeled folders. Insurance, taxes, medical records, retirement statements. I pulled everything onto the floor around me and began searching through the last 2 years month by month. At first, nothing looked unusual. Bills, receipts, routine notices. Then I noticed something strange. My bank statements showed several small, unexplained deposits spread over the previous year. Tiny amounts. $40, $75, $120. Random and inconsistent. I frowned. At the time, I must have assumed they were payroll adjustments or pharmacy reimbursement credits. But now, seeing them after Daniel's revelation, they looked different somehow. Like fragments. Like pieces of something larger skimmed away before reaching me. My chest tightened again. Around noon, another memory surfaced suddenly. Last spring, I had called Daniel after my car battery died during a thunderstorm. Vanessa answered instead. She told me Daniel was in meetings all day but promised she would handle everything. 2 days later, an envelope arrived in my mailbox containing $200 cash with no note attached. I remembered feeling strangely embarrassed accepting it. Ashamed even, as if I had become charity instead of family. But now another possibility emerged. Had that money originally been part of the monthly payments Daniel believed I already received? I leaned back slowly against the couch cushions, feeling colder by the minute despite the heater finally rattling to life nearby. Tiny memories kept rearranging themselves. The birthday flowers Daniel supposedly sent that never arrived. The family vacation I only learned about afterward through social media photos. The times Vanessa insisted she had already updated me about plans Daniel later seemed surprised I did not know. It was like watching fog lift from an entire stretch of road I had been driving blind for years. Around 1 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time it was Daniel. His voice sounded rough. Tired. Mom, he said immediately, I found something. I sat up straighter. What kind of something? Papers shuffled on his end before he answered. The property management company for the lake house has been sending monthly maintenance reports to an email address connected to Vanessa. My stomach dropped heavily. Are you certain? Yes. His voice hardened slightly. And the mailing address attached to the property tax documents is not your apartment. It is a post office box registered under Vanessa's old business account. Snow tapped softly against my windows while silence stretched between us. Finally, I asked the question neither of us had wanted to say out loud yet. Daniel, do you think your wife stole from us? He exhaled shakily. I do not know what to think anymore. Neither did I, because betrayal inside families rarely arrives all at once. It arrives slowly, quietly, through tiny manipulations that seem harmless individually, until one day you realize entire years have disappeared beneath someone else's control. I spoke to Vanessa this morning. I admitted carefully. Daniel went quiet immediately. What did she say? That there must be some misunderstanding. He laughed once under his breath. Bitterly this time. Funny how all the misunderstandings seemed to benefit her. I closed my eyes briefly. Hearing the hurt in my son's voice cracked something open inside me. Because despite everything, Daniel was hurting too. The realization seemed to be destroying him piece by piece in real time. Mom, he said softly after another silence. Why did you never tell me how hard things had gotten after Dad passed away? I looked down at my worn slippers against the carpet. Because parents spend their whole lives trying not to become problems for their children. You are not a problem. That may be, I whispered. But loneliness has a way of convincing people otherwise. Neither of us spoke for several seconds after that. Then Daniel cleared his throat quietly. I need to meet with someone tomorrow, he said. An attorney. And maybe a forensic accountant. The words sounded cold. Official. Dangerous. I stared out the window at the falling snow while my pulse slowly quickened again. Somewhere deep inside me, something had begun shifting overnight. Yesterday I still wanted desperately to believe this was all a mistake. Today that hope felt weaker. Smaller. Like a candle struggling against wind. Because the more pieces we uncovered, the less accidental everything looked. And for the first time in years, I found myself wondering not how much money had been taken from me, but how much of my life had quietly been stolen while I kept apologizing for needing so little. The following afternoon, Daniel asked me to meet him at a small coffee shop halfway between my apartment and his office downtown. Snow still covered most of the sidewalks, though the roads had turned into gray slush from traffic and salt trucks. I arrived early, mostly because I had barely slept again the night before. My mind would not stop replaying old memories through this new, unsettling lens. I sat near the window wearing my thick wool coat and watched people hurry past outside carrying shopping bags and paper coffee cups. Christmas decorations hung from every streetlight downtown now. Red ribbons, Wreaths. Tiny white lights wrapped around bare trees. Everything looked cheerful in the way cities try very hard to appear cheerful during the holidays. But loneliness does not care about decorations. Daniel walked in exactly at 2 o'clock. The moment I saw him, my chest tightened. He looked exhausted. His usually neat dark hair was slightly disheveled, and faint shadows rested beneath his eyes. For the first time in years, he looked less like the polished businessman everyone admired and more like the little boy who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms. He spotted me immediately and forced a tired smile before sitting down across from me. "You got here early," he said quietly. "Old habits," I replied softly. He nodded once, then wrapped both hands around the coffee cup he had brought from the counter. I noticed his fingers trembling slightly. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he reached into his leather briefcase and removed a thick folder. The sound of paper sliding across the table seemed unusually loud beneath the soft Christmas music playing overhead. "I spent most of last night reviewing financial records," he said carefully. "And this morning I met with a forensic accountant my company uses during fraud investigations." Fraud. Hearing the word spoken aloud made something cold settle deeper into my stomach. Daniel opened the folder slowly. Inside were printed bank statements, property documents, tax records, and emails highlighted in yellow marker. Organized, precise, clinical. I stared at the papers while a strange numbness spread through me. My entire life had always existed in emotional terms. Family dinners, birthdays, phone calls, holidays. Meanwhile, someone else had apparently turned my life into spreadsheets and transactions without me realizing it. Daniel slid one paper toward me. "This is the original purchase agreement for the lake house." My eyes moved slowly across the document. Lake Morrison property. Purchased 2 years earlier. Estimated value, $840,000. I stopped breathing for a second when I saw the next line. Intended owner, Evelyn Carter. My own name looked foreign sitting there on expensive legal paperwork. Daniel's voice softened slightly. "I bought it after you told me how much Dad loved that lake during your anniversary trips." Richard. Just hearing my husband mentioned unexpectedly still hurts sometimes, even after 3 years. Richard used to take me to Lake Morrison every October when the leaves changed color. We stayed in tiny cabins because we could never afford luxury vacations back then. But those weekends were some of the happiest memories of my marriage. We would wake before sunrise and drink coffee wrapped in blankets beside the water while fog drifted across the lake. "You remembered that?" I asked quietly. Daniel looked genuinely confused by the question. Of course I remembered. I lowered my eyes quickly toward the paperwork because suddenly tears threatened to rise again. My son had remembered. He had tried to do something kind, and somehow that kindness had been quietly stolen before it ever reached me. Daniel slid another document forward. This is where things stopped making sense. I studied the page carefully. Transfer authorization forms. Digital signatures. Ownership reassignment requests filed only 6 months after the property purchase. My eyes narrowed slightly. "This signature," Daniel nodded grimly. "It is supposed to be yours." I stared at the looping electronic signature displayed on the page. It looked almost convincing at first glance. But not quite. The E in Evelyn curved wrong. The spacing was unnatural. Too careful. Like someone copying handwriting rather than naturally producing it. "I did not sign this," I whispered. "I know." Daniel's jaw tightened visibly. "The accountant believes someone copied your signature digitally and transferred the ownership into a shell company connected to Vanessa's consulting business." I leaned back slowly against the chair, suddenly dizzy again. Around us, people continued chatting casually over pastries and coffee while my world quietly rearranged itself piece by piece. A young mother near the counter laughed as her toddler spilled whipped cream across the table. A college student typed on a laptop wearing headphones. Ordinary life kept moving while mine cracked open silently beneath it. "There is more," Daniel said carefully. He hesitated before continuing, almost like he was ashamed. "The monthly support payments I set up for you." I already knew before he finished. "They never reached me." He nodded once. "Most of them were rerouted into accounts Vanessa controlled." Shame flickered across his face so strongly that my heart ached for him despite everything. "Daniel," I said gently, "you did not know." "I should have." His voice broke slightly. "God, Mom, I should have noticed." I looked down at my coffee cup. The liquid inside had gone cold already. People rarely notice manipulation when it arrives wrapped in love, I said quietly. That sentence seemed to hit him hard. He rubbed both hands across his face and stared out the window for several moments before speaking again. There is something else bothering me, he admitted. The accountant thinks this did not start with the lake house. I looked up slowly. What do you mean? Daniel swallowed hard. There are irregular transfers going back almost 4 years. Small amounts at first. Insurance reimbursements. Gift transfers. Charitable withdrawals from family accounts. My chest tightened painfully again. For years. Around the same time Vanessa had started insisting on helping organize family finances and schedules because Daniel was always traveling for business. Suddenly, another memory surfaced sharply. 2 summers ago, Daniel mailed me a birthday card saying he enclosed money for a weekend getaway. The envelope arrived empty. At the time I assumed cash must have fallen out during delivery. Vanessa later laughed kindly and said the postal service was becoming unreliable lately. I remembered apologizing for mentioning it at all. Apologizing. The realization made my stomach turn. Mom, Daniel said softly. I think she isolated us on purpose. I could not answer immediately because deep down, I had already begun realizing the same thing myself. Isolation rarely happens dramatically. It happens gradually through delays, excuses, interruptions, and small emotional manipulations repeated over and over until distance feels normal. Vanessa had never openly told Daniel to abandon me. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she made herself the gatekeeper to our relationship. Little by little, until eventually every conversation passed through her first. Every plan, every invitation, every update. Do you remember last Easter? I asked quietly. Daniel frowned slightly. At the house. I nodded. You told me afterward you were disappointed I canceled at the last minute. Confusion crossed his face immediately. You said you were sick. I stared at him. Vanessa called me 2 days before and said you wanted to keep the holiday small because work had stressed you out. Daniel went completely still. Mom, I never said that. Silence settled heavily between us again. Then more memories surfaced. Mother's Day dinners that mysteriously changed locations after invitations were already sent. Family trips I learned about afterward. Phone calls Vanessa promised to relay that somehow disappeared entirely. Piece by piece, a pattern emerged too large to ignore anymore. Daniel leaned back slowly, his expression hollow now. How long has this been happening? He whispered. I looked out the window at snow melting slowly along the curb outside. Long enough that I started believing being forgotten was normal. His face crumpled slightly at that. For a second, he looked exactly like Richard after difficult days at the hospital before he passed away. Wounded in a quiet, exhausted way. I am going to fix this, Daniel said firmly. But I noticed something important then. He no longer sounded angry. He sounded devastated. Because discovering financial theft hurts. But discovering someone quietly manipulated your understanding of family for years cuts far deeper. I folded my hands carefully together on the table and studied my son's tired face. Somewhere beneath the grief and shock, another feeling had begun forming quietly inside me since Thanksgiving night. Clarity. Cold, uncomfortable clarity. And once certain truths become visible, they can never fully disappear again. 3 days passed before I heard directly from Vanessa again. During those 3 days, my apartment felt different somehow. Not larger, not warmer, just clearer. As if someone had finally cleaned a dirty window I had been staring through for years without realizing how badly distorted everything looked. I stopped making excuses for certain memories. That was the strangest part. Once the truth begins surfacing, your mind quietly revisits old wounds and removes all the lies you once wrapped around them to survive. On Sunday morning, I stood at my kitchen sink washing a single coffee cup while snow melted steadily outside. The window. My phone rang around 9:30. Vanessa's name appeared again. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. Hello. I answered calmly. Her voice sounded softer than usual. Controlled. Careful. Evelyn, I was hoping we could talk. I dried my hands slowly with a dish towel before responding. We are talking. A brief silence followed. I mean in person, she clarified gently. I think there have been misunderstandings, and I would really like the chance to clear things up before Daniel makes assumptions that damage the family permanently. There was that word again. Family. She used it like a shield every time accountability came too close. I walked toward the living room window and looked down at the parking lot below, while she continued speaking. Daniel has been under enormous stress lately, she said. You know how emotional he becomes when guilt is involved. Guilt. Interesting choice of word. Not concern. Not confusion. Guilt. What exactly do you want to explain? I asked quietly. She exhaled softly, almost dramatically. There are financial details you may not fully understand. Investments. Tax structures. Asset protection strategies. Daniel tends to act impulsively when emotions get involved. I nearly smiled at that. For years I had underestimated Vanessa because she rarely raised her voice. People often mistake calm manipulation for intelligence simply because it arrives wearing expensive clothes and polished manners. I understand more than you think, I said softly. Another pause. Then her tone shifted slightly colder beneath the sweetness. I just hope you remember how much Daniel loves me before this turns into something ugly. I stared out at the gray winter sky while a quiet realization settled inside me. She was afraid. Not emotional. Not remorseful. Afraid. Goodbye, Vanessa, I said calmly. Evelyn, wait. I hung up before she finished speaking. My hand remained steady the entire time. That surprised me more than anything. A week ago, confrontation with Vanessa would have left me shaky and apologetic for hours afterward. But something had changed quietly inside me since Thanksgiving night. The fear was leaving room for clarity. Around noon, there was a knock at my apartment door. I opened it expecting perhaps my neighbor Eleanor returning my casserole dish. Instead, a woman in her early 40s stood there holding a leather folder against her coat. She had tired eyes and auburn hair pulled into a low bun. Mrs. Carter? She asked carefully. Yes. My name is Margaret Ellis. I used to work for Daniel. Something about the tension in her expression made my stomach tighten immediately. I stepped aside quietly and let her in. Margaret sat stiffly at my kitchen table while I made coffee neither of us touched. Snow tapped softly against the windows while the apartment heater rattled unevenly nearby. Finally, she placed the leather folder on the table between us. I debated for 2 days whether to come here, she admitted quietly. But after Daniel called me Thursday night asking questions about property transfers, I realized I could not stay silent anymore. My pulse quickened. What kind of questions? Margaret folded her hands carefully together. About Lake Morrison. About redirected payments. About Vanessa. Hearing Vanessa's name spoken by someone else suddenly made everything feel frighteningly real. Margaret looked down briefly before continuing. I worked as Daniel's executive assistant for almost 6 years. During the last 3, Vanessa became increasingly involved in handling personal financial matters. I remembered all the times Vanessa proudly described herself as helping simplify Daniel's life. At the time, it sounded supportive, loving even. At first, nothing seemed unusual, Margaret continued. She requested copies of schedules, handled travel confirmations, organized family correspondence. But gradually, she began controlling access to more sensitive information. She opened the folder slowly and slid several printed emails toward me. I made copies before resigning last spring. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the papers. Email chains, transfer authorizations, messages from Vanessa requesting address changes for mailed documents, instructions rerouting property reports away from Daniel's office. One email made my chest tighten instantly. Please ensure Evelyn Carter no longer receives physical mail regarding the property. Daniel wants everything streamlined digitally moving forward. I looked up sharply. Daniel never said that. Margaret nodded slowly. I know. The room suddenly felt colder. Why did you not tell him? I whispered. Shame crossed Margaret's face immediately. Because every time I questioned Vanessa, she implied I was overstepping boundaries in their marriage. Eventually, she convinced Daniel I was becoming difficult to work with. Another puzzle piece slid into place quietly. Isolation. Control. Redirection. Not just toward me. Toward anyone who threatened her control over information. Did Daniel know about any of this? I asked carefully. Margaret shook her head immediately. I do not believe so. Honestly, Mrs. Carter, I think he trusted her completely. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course he did. Daniel loved deeply. He always had. Even as a child, he believed the best about people long after others would have stopped trying. Richard used to say our son's heart was both his greatest strength and the thing most likely to hurt him someday. I opened my eyes again slowly. Why come forward now? Margaret hesitated before answering. Because last March, I accidentally saw something I have not been able to forget. She slid another document toward me. It was a scanned photograph attached to an email. A smiling picture of Vanessa standing on the dock beside a beautiful lake house. My lake house. Christmas decorations glowed warmly through the windows behind her. She looked comfortable there. At home. My throat tightened painfully. This was taken last December, Margaret said quietly, while you were working overtime shifts at the pharmacy. I stared at the image while something deep inside me finally hardened completely. Not rage. Rage burns hot and fast. This felt colder than that. Cleaner. For 3 years I had blamed aging for my loneliness. Blamed distance. Busy schedules. Modern life. Meanwhile, another woman had apparently been living inside the future my son intended for me. There is something else, Margaret added carefully. Last year, Daniel instructed Vanessa to set aside additional funds for your retirement care after your surgery consultation. I frowned in confusion. What surgery consultation? Margaret looked startled. Your knee replacement. I stared at her silently. My knee specialist recommended surgery 18 months earlier after arthritis damage worsened significantly. I postponed it because even with insurance, I could not afford recovery costs or unpaid time away from work. Vanessa knew that. She sat beside Daniel during one family dinner while I explained why I was delaying treatment. I remembered her squeezing my hand sympathetically across the table. We will figure something out, she promised warmly back then. Margaret lowered her eyes slightly. Daniel transferred almost $40,000 into a medical account for your recovery expenses. I stopped breathing for a second. $40,000. Enough to change everything. Enough to stop living in pain every morning just to survive financially. I looked down at my swollen hands resting against the table and suddenly understood something devastating. Vanessa had not simply stolen money. She had stolen comfort, stability, health, time, entire years of dignity. Margaret reached across the table gently. I am sorry, she whispered. I looked up slowly toward the snow-covered window beside us. Outside, children were building a snowman near the parking lot entrance while their mother laughed nearby. Life continuing normally again while mine quietly collapsed into truth piece by piece. No, I said softly after a long silence. You are the first person who finally told me the truth. That night, after Margaret left, I sat alone in my apartment long after the coffee in my mug had gone cold. The folder she brought remained open across my kitchen table beneath the yellow overhead light. Emails, financial transfers, property records, tiny pieces of proof scattered across the surface like fragments from a life I no longer recognized. Outside, snow drifted steadily beneath the parking lot lights, covering everything in quiet white silence. I used to think silence meant peace. But there is another kind of silence entirely. The kind built from years of withheld truths. My eyes settled again on the photograph of Vanessa standing beside the lake house dock last Christmas. She wore a cream-colored sweater and dark jeans, smiling into the camera with a mug of hot chocolate in her hands. Warm lights glowed through the windows behind her. My windows. My kitchen. My fireplace. I stared at the image until something inside me finally stopped hurting and started hardening instead. Not because of the money. Not even because of the house. It was the comfort of the photo that stayed with me. The ease in her posture. The certainty that everything belonged to her. Meanwhile, I spent that same Christmas wrapped in blankets inside this apartment because I could not afford to turn the heat above 64 degrees. Around 8:30, my phone rang again. Daniel. I answered quietly. How are you holding up? He asked softly. I looked around the apartment before answering. The old recliner Richard bought 20 years ago. The tiny artificial Christmas tree I still had not decorated yet. The medicine bottles lined neatly beside the sink. I am tired, I admitted. He exhaled heavily. Mom, I met with another attorney this afternoon. I sat up straighter immediately. And the evidence keeps getting worse. His voice sounded hollow now, like someone slowly realizing the floor beneath them was never stable to begin with. The shell company connected to Vanessa purchased additional properties over the last 2 years. My chest tightened. Using your money? Some of it, he admitted quietly. But the accountant also believes she moved money from joint investment accounts without my full understanding. I closed my eyes briefly. The scale of everything was becoming difficult to absorb. This was no longer just manipulation hidden inside family tension. This was systematic. Planned. Daniel, I said carefully. Have you confronted her directly yet? Silence stretched for several seconds. Not fully, he admitted. Every time I try, she cries or changes the subject or tells me I am letting stress destroy our marriage. I almost smiled sadly at that because it sounded exactly like Vanessa. She never exploded emotionally. She redirected, deflected, softened conversations until other people began questioning their own instincts instead. She keeps saying you misunderstand her, Daniel continued quietly. That she was only trying to simplify financial matters while I focused on work. I walked slowly toward the window and watched snow collecting against parked cars below. Do you believe her? I asked gently. His answer came almost immediately. No, something shifted inside me hearing that single word. Because for the first time since Thanksgiving, I realized my son was finally seeing clearly too. Mom, Daniel said carefully after another pause. There is something else I need to ask you. What is it? He hesitated. Would you come with me tomorrow? Where? To Lake Morrison. My heart stopped for a second. I gripped the windowsill tightly. Why? Because I think you deserve to see the place that was supposed to be yours. I did not answer right away. The idea alone felt surreal. Painful somehow. Like visiting the ghost of another life. I do not know if that is a good idea, I admitted softly. Maybe not, Daniel said quietly. But I think we both need to understand what was taken. The drive to Lake Morrison took almost 3 hours the next morning. Snow covered most of the highway shoulders while pale winter sunlight reflected sharply across frozen fields. Daniel drove silently for long stretches, both hands tight against the steering wheel. I noticed he looked at least 10 years older than he had 1 week earlier. Betrayal ages people quickly, especially betrayal that forces you to re-examine your own memories. Around us, the landscape slowly shifted from city suburbs to wooded roads lined with bare trees and frozen lakes. Eventually, the familiar sign appeared ahead. Lake Morrison. My chest tightened painfully at the sight of it. Richard loved this place. We used to save all year for those tiny weekend trips here. Back then we stayed in small rental cabins with squeaky floors and outdated furniture, but none of that mattered because we were together. Some of my happiest memories existed near this lake. Daniel finally spoke as we turned onto a winding road near the water. I wanted you to have peace here after Dad died. I looked out the passenger window quietly. You already gave me peace once, I said softly. You were my son. His jaw tightened slightly at that, but he did not answer. 20 minutes later, the house appeared through the trees. I stopped breathing for a moment. It was beautiful, not enormous or flashy the way rich people sometimes build lake houses to impress strangers. This place looked warm, thoughtful, wide windows facing the water, stone fireplace chimney, soft gray siding dusted with snow, a wooden porch wrapping around the front. Richard would have loved it instantly. Daniel parked slowly in the driveway, but neither of us moved right away. I stared at the house while grief settled over me in heavy waves. Not grief for the building itself. Grief for all the moments that should have happened here, but never did. Morning coffee beside the lake. Quiet holidays. Recovery after surgery. Peaceful evenings watching snow fall through those windows instead of sitting alone beside unpaid bills in my apartment. Daniel finally turned off the engine. Mom, how many times did she come here? I asked quietly. He swallowed hard before answering. The neighbors told the investigator they saw Vanessa here often over the last 2 years. Sometimes with friends, sometimes alone. I nodded once slowly. Somehow hearing it spoken aloud hurt less than I expected now. Pain reaches a point eventually where it becomes almost calm. We stepped out into the snow-covered driveway together. Cold wind moved gently through the trees while the frozen lake shimmered pale blue beyond the house. I walked slowly toward the porch steps, my boots crunching softly against fresh snow. Then I stopped suddenly near the front door, because hanging beside the entrance was a small brass plaque. Lake House Rules. I frowned slightly and stepped closer. Below the words were several engraved lines. Leave worries behind. Make memories. Family first. But it was the final line that made my stomach twist. Welcome home, Vanessa. I stared at those words silently, while something cold settled fully into place inside me. Not confusion anymore. Not suspicion. Certainty. Daniel stepped beside me and saw the plaque too. The color drained slowly from his face. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Wind moved softly across the lake behind us while snowflakes drifted through the gray afternoon sky. Then Daniel whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. She erased you. I looked at the house one final time before answering. No, I said softly. She tried to. We stayed at the lake house less than an hour that afternoon, but something about stepping inside changed me permanently. The moment Daniel unlocked the front door, warm air wrapped around us, carrying the scent of cedarwood and vanilla candles. Someone had clearly been there recently. The heating system hummed softly. Decorative throw blankets rested neatly across the couch. A bowl of pine cones and silver ornaments sat arranged perfectly on the coffee table beside the fireplace. The entire house looked lived in. Loved, even. I walked slowly across the hardwood floor, while my boots left tiny wet marks from melted snow. Every room carried traces of a life that should have belonged to me. In the kitchen, polished copper pans hung above a marble island beneath soft pendant lights. Near the window facing the lake stood a small reading chair beside a bookshelf. My throat tightened painfully when I noticed several novels I once mentioned wanting to read during a family dinner 2 years earlier. Vanessa remembered those conversations. She simply used them for herself instead. Daniel moved quietly through the house behind me, saying almost nothing. I think the silence hurt him more than anger would have, because each room forced him to see how carefully his wife had built a private world from things intended for someone else. Upstairs, the master bedroom overlooked the frozen lake through enormous windows framed by cream-colored curtains. I stopped near the doorway when I noticed framed photographs resting on the dresser. Vanessa smiling beside friends on the dock during summer. Vanessa wrapped in a winter scarf beside the fireplace. Vanessa holding wine glasses beneath Christmas lights on the porch. Not a single photograph included Daniel. She told me she rarely came here, he said quietly behind me. I turned slowly toward him. And you believed her? It was not an accusation, just truth. Daniel rubbed one hand across his face tiredly. I spent the last 3 years building a company, he admitted softly. I thought trusting my wife was what good husbands were supposed to do. I looked back toward the photographs. Trust. Such a beautiful thing when placed in the right hands. Such a dangerous thing when it is not. We eventually made our way downstairs again in silence. But before leaving, I wandered into a smaller room near the back of the house. The moment I stepped inside, my chest tightened sharply. It was decorated as a sewing room. Pale blue walls. A large wooden crafting table near the window. Storage baskets filled with fabric and yarn. Even an antique sewing machine sitting carefully beneath a lamp in the corner. Daniel appeared behind me moments later and froze too. Mom, his voice cracked slightly. You told me once Dad wanted to build you a sewing room after retirement. I swallowed hard and looked away quickly toward the frozen lake outside the window. Richard used to joke that once he retired, he would finally stop pretending not to notice fabric stores while I accidentally wandered inside them. We always planned for a quieter life someday. More time together. Less rushing. It is strange how people spend decades believing there will always be more time later. I forgot I even told you that. I whispered. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the floor. I did not. We left shortly afterward. But as we drove away from the lake house, I realized something important had shifted inside me again. Until now, most of my grief centered around what Vanessa stole financially. The money, the property, the security. But standing inside that house showed me something far more painful. She had studied my life carefully enough to recreate my dreams for herself. Back in the city, darkness had already settled by the time Daniel dropped me off at my apartment. Snow crunched beneath our shoes as we walked toward the building entrance together. He looked exhausted again, hollowed out somehow. Mom, he said quietly before I opened the door. I filed for emergency financial injunctions this afternoon. I looked at him carefully. Meaning Vanessa cannot move additional money or sell assets while the investigation continues. I nodded slowly. He hesitated before continuing. The attorneys also believe there is enough evidence for criminal fraud charges. The words hung heavily between us in the cold evening air. Criminal fraud. Hearing it spoken aloud made everything feel strangely distant for a moment. Like some terrible story happening to another family instead of mine. What happens now? I asked softly. Daniel stared down at the snow-covered sidewalk. I honestly do not know. Neither did I. Because despite everything Vanessa had done, the destruction spreading through our family still felt deeply sad somehow. Betrayal does not only destroy trust. It destroys the version of reality people believe they were living inside. Daniel, I said gently, whatever happens next, do not let hatred consume you. He looked up at me then with exhausted eyes. How are you still protecting other people after all this? I almost smiled sadly at that. Because bitterness is expensive too, I answered softly. He hugged me tightly before leaving. The kind of hug he had not given me in years. Real, vulnerable, almost desperate. And standing there beneath the parking lot lights while snow drifted quietly around us, I suddenly realized something heartbreaking. Vanessa had not only stolen years from me, she had stolen years from him too. Years of closeness, family dinners, honest conversations, small, ordinary moments between mother and son that never happened because someone else constantly stood between us. Upstairs in my apartment, I made tea and wrapped myself in a blanket on the couch. But for once, the apartment no longer felt quite as lonely. Painful, yes. Uncertain, absolutely. But no longer lonely in the same way. My phone buzzed around 9:45. A text message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. I opened it cautiously. You have no idea what you are destroying. No signature. No explanation necessary. Vanessa. I stared at the message quietly while steam curled upward from my untouched tea. A second message appeared moments later. Daniel is emotional right now, but eventually he will realize you manipulated him against me. I read the words twice before setting the phone down carefully beside me. Strange. For years, messages from Vanessa had the power to make me anxious almost instantly. They made me second-guess myself, apologize unnecessarily, shrink emotionally without realizing it. But now, sitting alone beneath the soft glow of my living room lamp, her words no longer frightened me. They sounded desperate, small even. My eyes drifted toward the window where snow continued falling steadily outside. Then another message appeared. You always hated me because Daniel chose me over you. This time I did laugh softly under my breath. Not because it was funny, because suddenly I understood everything much more clearly. Vanessa never wanted money alone. She wanted position, importance, control. She needed to stand at the center of every relationship while pushing everyone else outward quietly over time. Some people steal because they are greedy. Others steal because emptiness inside them never stops growing no matter how much they take. I picked up the phone one final time and typed only 6 words before sending the reply. No, Vanessa. He never truly did. Then I turned the phone off completely and sat quietly beside the window watching snow blanket the city while, for the first time in years, I stopped feeling invisible. The next week unfolded slowly, almost unnaturally quietly, as if everyone involved understood that something irreversible had already happened and no one quite knew how to move afterward. Daniel stopped staying at the house he shared with Vanessa. Instead, he rented a suite at a downtown hotel near his office while attorneys and forensic accountants continued reviewing years of financial records. Every day seemed to uncover something new. Another hidden account, another unauthorized transfer, another carefully disguised lie tucked beneath ordinary life. Meanwhile, I returned to work at the pharmacy Monday morning like I always did. There is something strangely comforting about routine when the rest of your world feels unstable. The automatic doors opened and closed. Prescription bottles clicked across counters. Customers complained about insurance deductibles and winter colds. Ordinary life continued moving around me while mine quietly transformed beneath the surface. Around noon, my manager Denise pulled me aside near the break room. Evelyn, she said gently, you look exhausted. I smiled faintly. Long week. She studied me carefully for a moment before squeezing my arm softly. Do not let whatever it is break you. I thanked her quietly and returned to stocking shelves. But her words stayed with me the rest of the afternoon. Because the truth was, something inside me had already broken weeks ago. I simply had not realized it until now. That evening, Daniel came to my apartment carrying takeout containers from my favorite Italian restaurant downtown. The small gesture alone nearly made me emotional because it reminded me of who my son used to be before years of distance slowly settled between us. He looked slightly better than before, though deep exhaustion still shadowed his face constantly now. You remembered the eggplant parmesan, I said softly while unpacking the food onto plates. You used to order it every birthday after Dad's overtime checks came in, Daniel replied quietly. I glanced at him in surprise. You remember that? He gave me a tired smile. Mom, I remember more than you think. We ate at my tiny kitchen table while snow drifted softly outside the windows again. Winter had settled fully over the city now. Christmas lights glowed across neighboring apartment balconies while holiday commercials played faintly from someone's television nearby. For several minutes, we simply ate quietly together like normal people having dinner. It felt strangely precious. The attorneys interviewed Vanessa yesterday, Daniel finally said. I set my fork down slowly. How did that go? He laughed softly under his breath, though there was no humor in it. She cried for almost an hour. That sounded exactly right, too. Vanessa weaponized vulnerability better than anyone I had ever known. What did she say? I asked carefully. Daniel leaned back in his chair heavily. According to her, she only moved money temporarily to protect assets during market instability. I stared at him. Temporary. That was my reaction too. He rubbed both hands over his face tiredly. Then she claimed she intended to transfer everything back eventually. Did she explain the forged signatures? His silence answered before his words did. She blamed administrative confusion. I almost smiled sadly. Administrative confusion. Such polished language for betrayal. Daniel looked toward the window for a long moment before speaking again. Mom, there is something I need to admit. His voice sounded smaller somehow. Vulnerable in a way I had not heard since he was young. What is it? He swallowed hard. I think part of me knew something was wrong long before Thanksgiving. I stayed quiet. Not the fraud, he clarified quickly, but the distance between us. The way things changed after I married Vanessa. Pain flickered across his face. I just kept convincing myself adulthood naturally makes families drift apart. I folded my hands carefully around my tea mug. Sometimes it does, but not like this. He lowered his eyes toward the table. There were moments I should have paid attention to. He paused before continuing quietly. Do you remember when you had pneumonia 2 winters ago? Of course I remembered. I spent 4 nights alone in the hospital while a snowstorm shut down half the city. Vanessa told me Daniel was stuck overseas during a business conference and could not fly back in time. You called me once from the hospital, Daniel said softly. You sounded weak, confused. But when I asked if you needed anything, Vanessa later told me you were embarrassed and did not want me worrying. My chest tightened painfully. You were in Chicago that week, I said slowly. Daniel looked up sharply. How did you know that? I stared down at the steam rising from my tea. Because the nurse accidentally left the television on one evening. Your company was featured in a local business segment. Silence settled heavily between us. Mom, I remember watching you smile during that interview. I continued quietly. You looked happy, successful. I told myself there was no reason to interrupt your life just because I was sick. Daniel looked physically ill hearing that. I would have come immediately. I know that now. Tears filled his eyes suddenly, though he looked away quickly toward the window. My son always hated crying in front of people, even as a little boy. How many times did she do that? He whispered. I thought about the missed calls, the canceled holidays, the rewritten conversations, the strange misunderstandings that always somehow widened the distance between us little by little over time. Enough times that eventually I stopped expecting very much, I admitted softly. That sentence seemed to wound him more deeply than anything else. He leaned forward suddenly, elbows against the table, both hands covering his face. God, he whispered hoarsely. I thought you pulled away from me after Dad died. My heart broke hearing that. Because all these years, both of us had apparently been grieving the same distance while blaming ourselves for it. No, I said quietly. I thought you pulled away from me. The apartment fell completely silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator nearby. Then Daniel laughed once softly through tears. Not from happiness, from disbelief. She isolated us from each other while making both of us feel guilty about it. Yes, I whispered. And suddenly everything became painfully clear. All at once. Vanessa did not steal my son from me through dramatic arguments or cruel ultimatums. She simply controlled the space between us until eventually love itself became filtered through her interpretations. She became the translator for every misunderstanding she secretly created herself. The investigators found something else today, Daniel said quietly after several moments. I looked up slowly. What? Vanessa created separate email accounts years ago that looked almost identical to yours. Cold spread through my chest instantly. What do you mean? He reached into his coat pocket and handed me printed copies of emails. My hands trembled slightly as I read them. Messages supposedly sent from me declining invitations, refusing financial help, canceling family plans. One email stopped my breath completely. Daniel, please stop sending money. I need to maintain my independence and dignity. I stared at the words through blurred vision. I never wrote this. I know. His voice sounded hollow. but I believed you did. I looked down at the paper while grief settled over me in slow, heavy waves. Not because of the money anymore. Not even because of the manipulation itself. What shattered me was realizing how carefully someone studied my pride, my generation, my habits, and my love for my son, then used all of those things against us both. Daniel stood slowly and walked toward the sink, staring out the dark kitchen window into the snowy night beyond. I married someone I did not actually know, he whispered. I watched my son standing there alone beneath the weak kitchen light and realized something important then. Vanessa may have stolen years from us, but for the first time in a very long time, Daniel and I were finally standing inside the same truth together. December arrived quietly after that, covering the city in soft gray mornings and strings of Christmas lights that blinked through apartment windows at night. For most people, the holidays seemed to bring warmth and celebration. For our family, they brought attorneys, forensic reports, and truths neither Daniel nor I could avoid anymore. Every few days another discovery surfaced. Another hidden account. Another forged authorization. Another carefully manipulated conversation pulled from years of emails and financial records. But strangely, as more lies came into the light, I felt calmer instead of more devastated. Perhaps because uncertainty is often more painful than truth itself. One Thursday afternoon, Daniel picked me up after my shift ended at the pharmacy. Snow had started falling again, dusting the parking lot in white, while customers hurried toward their cars carrying bags of cough medicine and wrapping paper. I climbed carefully into his SUV, my knees aching from standing all day. Long shift, he asked gently. Holiday season, I replied softly. Everyone suddenly remembers they need prescriptions before snowstorms. He smiled faintly at that, but the exhaustion behind his eyes never fully disappeared anymore. We drove in silence for several minutes before he finally spoke again. The attorneys want us both present tomorrow. I looked toward him carefully. For what? A formal mediation meeting with Vanessa and her legal team. My stomach tightened immediately. I had not seen Vanessa face to face since Thanksgiving dinner. Only text messages, emails forwarded by attorneys. And somehow, avoiding direct contact had allowed me to maintain emotional distance from everything happening. Tomorrow would end that. Do I have to attend? I asked quietly. Daniel tightened his grip slightly on the steering wheel before answering. No, but they believe hearing directly from you may matter. I looked out the window at snow drifting beneath the streetlights. Matter to whom? To me, he admitted softly. That answer stayed with me the rest of the drive home. Later that evening, after Daniel left, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror longer than usual. The woman staring back at me looked older than she had a month earlier, but not weaker. My silver hair needed trimming again. Fine lines framed my eyes more deeply now. Yet beneath the exhaustion, something steadier had appeared too. I no longer looked like someone apologizing for taking up space. The mediation meeting took place Friday morning inside a downtown law office overlooking the river. The conference room smelled faintly like coffee and polished wood. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the gray winter skyline outside, while expensive abstract paintings lined the walls. Daniel sat beside me at the long table wearing a dark navy suit, his jaw tight with tension. Across from us sat Vanessa beside her attorney. The moment she entered the room, I understood immediately that she still believed she could control the outcome somehow. She wore a cream-colored designer coat and pearl earrings, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the snow outside. Calm, elegant, composed, the exact image she had spent years carefully constructing. When her eyes finally met mine across the table, she offered a small, sad smile. The kind people use at funerals. As if she were the injured one here. Evelyn, she said softly. You look tired. I almost admired the audacity of it. Almost. I am 70 years old, I replied calmly. Most people my age look tired eventually. Something flickered briefly behind her eyes then. Surprise perhaps. Because for years I had responded to tension by shrinking politely. Apologizing. Softening. Today I simply sat still. The attorneys began reviewing financial timelines and legal findings while snow drifted silently outside the windows. Numbers filled the room. Property transfers. Hidden accounts. Forged signatures. Unauthorized withdrawals. Vanessa remained composed through most of it, occasionally whispering to her attorney or folding her hands neatly together on the table. But I noticed tiny cracks beginning to appear. Her breathing quickened slightly whenever specific dates were mentioned. Her smile tightened each time new evidence surfaced. Mrs. Carter, one attorney finally said carefully, would you like to explain to the room how these financial events affected your daily life? Every eye turned toward me. For a moment, the old version of myself almost returned. The woman who avoided causing discomfort. The woman who minimized pain so other people could remain comfortable around it. Then I looked at Daniel sitting beside me. My son who spent years believing his mother pushed him away voluntarily, while someone else quietly manipulated us both. And suddenly silence no longer felt noble. I folded my hands calmly in my lap before speaking. 3 winters ago, I said softly, my doctor recommended knee replacement surgery because arthritis damage was becoming severe. The room stayed completely quiet. I postponed it because I could not afford recovery costs. Vanessa stared at the table. I continued anyway. Last February, I cut my blood pressure medication in half for almost 2 weeks because I needed grocery money. Daniel closed his eyes briefly beside me. I kept my voice steady. There were nights I kept my apartment at 62 degrees during snowstorms because heating costs frightened me. One of the attorneys shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Good. They should feel uncomfortable. Meanwhile, I continued quietly. Someone else was living inside a lake house purchased in my name. Silence spread heavily through the room afterward. Not dramatic silence. Just the kind that arrives when truth finally stands fully visible. Vanessa finally looked. Up then. I never wanted her to suffer, she said suddenly, her voice trembling slightly now. That was never my intention. Intention. Another interesting word. Then what was your intention? Daniel asked quietly beside me. For the first time since entering the room, Vanessa seemed genuinely shaken. I was trying to protect our future, she whispered. Your business was growing too quickly. I handled things because you trusted me. Daniel stared at her for several seconds before answering. I trusted you to love my family, not erase them. The room went still again. Vanessa looked toward me suddenly then, tears filling her eyes. You always judged me, she said softly. From the beginning. I almost smiled sadly because even now, she still needed to make herself the victim somehow. No, I replied calmly. I welcomed you into my family. Her face tightened immediately. You never understood me. Perhaps not, I admitted softly. But I understand something now. She looked at me cautiously. I held her gaze steadily across the table. You spent years believing control and love were the same thing. For a second, genuine emotion crossed her face then. Not manipulation. Not performance. Something emptier. Almost frightened. Then it disappeared again behind polished composure. The mediation continued another 2 hours. Legal negotiations. Asset freezes. Property recovery discussions. Criminal exposure. By the end, even Vanessa's attorney looked exhausted. But the moment that stayed with me happened near the elevator afterward. Daniel and I were leaving the conference room when Vanessa suddenly called my name softly behind us. I turned slowly. She stood alone in the hallway now, coat wrapped tightly around herself while snow fell beyond the tall lobby windows nearby. For the first time since Thanksgiving, she looked small. Not glamorous. Not composed. Just tired. Did you ever hate me? She asked quietly. The question surprised me. I studied her carefully for several seconds before answering honestly. No, I said softly. I pitied you sometimes. But I never hated you. Her eyes filled instantly with tears at that. Real ones this time, I think. You have everything now? She whispered bitterly. I looked at her standing there beneath the cold lobby lights and realized something important. She still did not understand. No, I replied gently. I am simply getting my life back. Then Daniel and I walked away together while snow fell quietly across the city outside, and for the first time in years, I no longer felt like someone waiting for permission to belong in my own family.